Hello, folks. Good morning. All right, so today is Tuesday, the 13th, and today we are prepping for our first unit test. Now, we can do this a number of different ways. Today is just class. Tomorrow will be a review quiz to kind of get the brain working. The normal way I do this is by a fast master review. And what that means is I'm going to go through everything that we've covered in roughly the next 10 minutes for this entire unit. I'm going to go very, very fast. Be prepared as needed to pause video, to record stuff, to review, because we got to go. So, and I like to do this old school because I am old. Let's see, right about there. All right, so when we're taking a look at this, remember, when we started this year asking, what is science? And remember, science is that series of steps with the goal to explain and predict what's going to happen in nature. Why is it happening? How is it happening? Our particular science that we're looking at this year, hopefully you know by this point, is biology, which is our study of life. Now, in biology, and all sciences for that matter, what we're going to do is we are going to use the metric system for all of our measurements, because the US is a very young country. Everybody else was already doing science. We better communicate the same way that they do. Now, for the metric system, you're going to need to know the 3 different measurements that we use. So if we're talking about distance, it's the meter. If we're talking about mass, it's the gram. And if we're talking about volume, we use liters. And of course, also keep in mind that in something that everybody is much more familiar with, we also, for temperature, use degrees Celsius. All right. Got most of the intro there. Now, when we use something like the term biology, it's important to see how the breakdown works, right? Because bio, of course, means life, and ology means that study of. So when we put it together, it is the study of life. That comes down to our Latin. I'm just going to move the markers over here. And remember, our Latin is going to be something that you guys need to know. And in particular, for our Latin prefixes, I want all of you to know the following 4. They should be pretty straightforward. Bio, hydro, homo, and hetero. All right, these 4 prefixes will give you a massive edge in determining what a word means, even if you've never seen it before, especially going into our next unit. Okay, so after that, we then hit the scientific method. And there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps to it. Step 1. Remember, I talked about this. A lot of little kids, babies, are really, really good at this. They don't know anything about it, so they have to figure it all out. Step 1, we must define our problem. Then, step 2, now we're going to gather our data. Anything else that we could find, anything else that we already know. about that problem. Number 3, we're going to form our hypothesis. Remember, the hypothesis must be specific. This is why we always tell you guys to do an if-then statement. I already have people who are turning in labs that don't have a hypothesis. They're saying we can identify sharks. No, that is not a hypothesis. That is the then part. Where is your if? You must say what you're going to do in order to do the thing. Important distinction that I cannot accept unless you get that part. All right. Now, once you have your hypothesis, then you do your experiment. We're going to come back to that in just a moment. And finally, once the experiment is done, you take a look at the data that you have, and from there you can make your conclusion where you will either accept or refuse the hypothesis that you came up with. All right, let's zoom in on experiment because there is so much more that we need to go over in number 4, the experiment. Because in the experiment, we actually have to generate and create a whole bunch of different things. So first, we must determine what is our independent variable. The lights are dimming. That's not ideal. Now remember, the independent variable must be the thing that you are testing. The thing that you're changing. In this case, it's really easy to remember it, hopefully, because this is the if part of your hypothesis. Of course. Yes. Still see any of this? I mean, you can see it, but it ain't good. Hold on. Stupid lights. Stay on. All right, so independent variable. Then you also need to know your dependent variable. Now, I think the dependent variable is even easier because I remember D. And D for dependent is also the same D for data. It's going to be what you write down. So if you're testing how tall plants grow, you're recording how tall they get. That is your dependent variable, right? This is also the then of your hypothesis. Now, in order to have a good experiment, not only do we need to maintain these two, but then we've got a couple other things that we saw in the airplane lab that I asked everybody to make note of. You had to remember, you had to define your constants. And your constant should always be everything else. Because we want everything else to stay the same. Remember, this, your independent variable, should be your only change. Everything else should be a constant. And in class, I went over 3 things for you guys to memorize for constants. It was temperature, light, and water. Even if those don't make any sense, they are constants that we want to keep the same in every single experiment. And then finally, The very last thing that every good experiment needs, and your airplane lab was no different, we did this with one normal, unmodified airplane. And that was your control test. Remember, this is that unchanged. I don't know if you can see this. Kind of see it. There we go. So if we're changing this, we need a control that has no changes. All right. Our parts of the experiment all set. So now we get to move on to the second major thing that we did. Our 8 characteristics of life. COL, characteristics of life. Okay, so remember, you must know all 8 of these. First, let's start with the easy ones, the ones that everybody can name, right? All living things must be made of cells, must have DNA, must evolve, must reproduce. Right? That's half of them. Then come the harder ones that people have a more difficult time naming. All living things must get materials and energy. All living things must grow and develop. All living things must respond to their environment, to something that can happen. And finally, the last one, we could say all living things must maintain the balanced internal environment, or we can just say homeostasis. All right, here are our 8 characteristics of life. And just like in Marty Martian and in your Living Things project, you should be prepared to see some text and then for me to ask you, which characteristic of life does this represent? Or for me to say, here is a characteristic of life, which sentence best explains that characteristic of life? Or which of the following is not a characteristic of life? Or which of the following is a characteristic of life? So make sure that you know those 8. We spent quite a bit of time on them. And finally, the last thing that we went over, the last part of our intro material, and that is classification. So there was a memnotic device. I can never pronounce that right. It is the sequence of letters, something that you say in order to remember it. So remember, I always remembered that Cain, Philip came over for grape soda. And that keeps the letters in line. What it actually means is kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. If you can keep the letters in the right order, you'll be able to get any question that is asked. Nothing is going to give you 3 different terms that all start with G, looking for that gap. It'll be 3 of these terms, and genus will be one of them. So as long as you get the letters in the right order, you'll be good for it. Now remember, classification, the traditional form, had a problem. That problem was that the dude who started it decided, yo, look at all these things. Those 2 things look alike, so they must be related. Remember, it was based on appearance, which we know is not good. Because you can have lots of different animals that look alike, doesn't mean they are, does not mean they're related. So, modern DNA, the fix, was to instead base everything now off DNA, off genetic tests. Ladies and gentlemen, Unit 1 is done. Our test is coming for you on Thursday, and I hope that this was helpful. I will, of course, be in class every day for any additional questions. I hope that everybody has a great one.